Okay, I did hear the bell. Greg just set the clock for me again, and it's now 9. Last Sunday night, the clock wasn't working for some reason. I kept looking, and it was staying in the same spot. I could have preached for an hour and a half and would have never known it until I heard you snoring. Hospitalized at the moment at Memorial is Joyce Ross, and I understand that Joyce is going to be transferred to Riverside Hospital. They're going to address the heart valve issues. I don't know specifically when that's going to occur, but hopefully in the near future. Everyone else is about the same. Those who are in the nursing home are still in the nursing home, and those who are home recovering are home recovering. I'm impressed that you remembered to set your clocks ahead an hour, that you got here on time. Good to see Becky back. Becky's been out of town. Is that correct, Becky? She's been at a grazing conference with Cora Marshall in Morgantown, learning how to eat grass, I guess. Hopefully the wasps will stay away from you today as well. David is going to have our opening prayer at this time. Thank you, David. We're continuing our study of apologetics this morning. We're on slide 71, I believe, and there are approximately 170. My goal is to be finished by the end of May, and maybe somewhat earlier. As you know, we're missing 3 sessions this spring. On the 26th, everybody's going to meet in the back of the auditorium, and Kurt's going to be continuing a study of James, which he initiated last fall. And then early in April, he'll address chapter 4, and toward the end of the month, chapter 5. And that, again, will be in the back of the auditorium. And then I should be here all of May to wrap this study up. Before I really get started this morning, as you know, I do some visiting every week, and I find it often very enlightening. This past week, I learned while visiting that I will be retiring in May. Now, I had not heard that. But apparently the person who knew that shared it with lots of people. So I'm just here to tell you, as far as I know, that's not happening. And they assured me that they would let everyone know that they had told that they had misspoken. I don't know where that came from. Well, I know who told the person who told me, but where they got it, I'm at a loss. So if you've heard that and you're disappointed, I'm sorry. But that's not my plans. Now, of course, I've always operated under the assumption anytime you're ready for a new preacher, I will make it the smoothest transition in the world. But I really have a lot to do this year and had no plans of retiring in May. So if you hear that, if you would kind of stamp that down a little bit, I would appreciate it. Honestly, I have no idea where that originated, but obviously somebody thought that was the case. They even had my replacement picked out, so yeah. No, but I have threatened to send her to Columbus several times. But I have no interest in Columbus other than visiting my children and grandchildren. But I didn't want to say anything at the 10 o'clock hour, but I did want you to be aware that that rumor is going around, and I don't really get it, but you're at least aware of it, and as far as I know, it's false. Very quick review before we pick up our study this morning. We're looking at the various proofs for the existence of God that have been set forth. We began last week with Augustine's intuitional argument, and that argument simply says that man is incurably religious. And there must be a reason why that is the case, and he argues it's because of our divine origin. There is within all of us, from our Creator, an understanding. We just know that there's something beyond us, greater than self, that causes us to look up and seek God. The second argument we talked about was the moral argument. The fact that there is a sense of right and wrong, a universal concept of good and evil. And again, the question has to be asked, where does this originate? And the natural response is that our ability to know that there is good and evil, right and wrong, obviously must come from our past, the creative hand of God. We looked at the ontological argument briefly. This, in my judgment, is probably the weakest of any of the arguments that's been set forth. And it goes from the concept to necessary existence. If you can conceive of something, it must necessarily exist. And the illustration that I think I used is that saying that God does not exist is equivalent to saying that husbands are not married. The very nature of being a husband demands that there was a marriage. And if you can posit the existence of God, that demands his existence. And for some people, that seems to be a pretty effective argument, but it's over my head. Then we looked at the cosmological argument. That's the argument from Psalm 19, 1 through 3, Hebrews 3, 4. The heavens declare God's glory, and every house is built by some man, and he that built all things is God. And the idea is simply for every effect that we can acknowledge, we, in the process of acknowledging the effect, understand there has to be a cause or causes to produce that effect. You look at a watch or a Fitbit or whatever it is you have on your arm right now, or the phone that's attached to your belt or in your purse. You see those things and you immediately know that they did not happen without causation. The effect demands a cause or causes. And we look at this world, we look at the sun, the moon, and the stars, and we are compelled to say these things did not happen accidentally. Someone or ones or something caused those things to come into existence. That seems to me really to be insurmountable. I cannot point to anything that does not have a cause or causes. And you may be able to think of something, but again, I can't. And I find that just overwhelming proof that there must be someone, something higher, greater. Now, when I say that the cosmological argument, from my perspective, is overwhelming, I realize that the cosmological argument doesn't tell us who God is, or if there's one or many gods, and doesn't reveal for us what our Creator or creators would demand of us. That will ultimately lead us to our final source of evidence for God's existence. But where we pick up things today, having looked at the cosmological argument, is to address the teleological argument. Don't let these big words throw you. The teleological argument is simply the argument for design. And when you look at design, that's an indicator of a designer, just as when you look at an effect, that is an indication of a cause or causes. Relative to the teleological argument, we dealt with this last week just in wrapping up. We have from the 139th Psalm, verse 14, the psalmist says, I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made, and that my soul knows right well. That's the King James translation of the text. He's talking about the human body and how we have been formed and how our bodies work. And when you think about it, and the very fact that you're able to think about it's rather unique, is it not? Do you know of any other creature that actually thinks about his or her creation and how they operate, how the body works? I'm not going to say that no other creatures smile, because I'll get another picture of a smiling dog. But I don't believe they contemplate how they have been formed and how their bodies work. We do that. And when we do, we stand in awe. We marvel at this creation. And that's what the psalmist was saying. The way we are put together clearly does demand someone higher, greater, God, if you please, as the ultimate source. And when the psalmist wrote the 18th Psalm, in my judgment, he's really expressing the same kinds of ideas. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth, and you've set your glory above the heavens. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and stars, which you've set in place, what's man that you're mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you visiteth him? And of course, there are messianic overtones to the psalm, but the 8th Psalm also expresses the teleological argument that God's creation is wonderful to behold, and it works precisely, and it works continuously. For literally as far down the future as man can point, man can mathematically determine the path of the moon around the earth and the earth's orbit around the sun. Things are that finely tuned so that understanding the process and recognizing that this is an orderly process that works, that has always worked and will continue to work for as long as the Creator intends, says a great deal about origin. You don't get that kind of regularity, that kind of precision accidentally. It had to be designed to accomplish that end. Now, having said all of that, we turn to the kinds of designs that we can consider. I'm going to quickly go through the list, and then we'll go back and specifically highlight each one so that we understand what we're talking about. But we have design of order, of purpose, of simplicity. The simpler something can be made, the more likely it is to work, and the longer it is that it will work. So with just about anything that man makes, there is always an effort to continue to refine it, to make it simpler and more efficient. We have, in terms also, the design of complexity. In my judgment, that's what the psalmist was thinking about when he proclaimed his awe at the human body and how it's made. You don't have to think about breathing, do you? Now you can, and you can stop breathing for brief periods of time, but you have been designed so that you just do certain things automatically. You never think about your heart beating in terms of controlling it. It just does what it's designed to do. And when the design is not invaded by disease or some technical problem, it just works wonderfully well. Our bodies are really complex organisms, and that complex nature was an evidence of design. But you go from complexity then to beauty, and then sense and cognition, knowledge, design of information. This is specifically in relationship to DNA. And then you have the design of the cosmic constants, and that probably doesn't mean a whole lot to you, and so we'll touch on that briefly. Let's begin with design of order. How does this happen? The kinds of order we're talking about are qualitative sequences. Colors come in qualitative sequences when arranged in a spectrum. Similarly, sounds are the same way. Taste, textures, other qualities come in orderly arrangements where the members of the sequence are arranged in a patterned way and not chaotically. Now, most of the time when things happen accidentally, there's all kinds of chaos. And when we see examples of order, that does it not indicate design, and that design demands a designer in such fundamental things as colors and sounds and taste. And then we have regularities of spatial compressance. Well, now that's a fancy term, isn't it? Man-made examples would be towns with all their roads at right angles to each other. That doesn't happen normally. If you follow what typically happens when a path is made, a path is generally the route of least resistance, and it winds and it curves and it goes around obstacles and just all over the place. When you see everything laid out at right angles, what do you know? That didn't happen accidentally. There was design involved. You go to a library and you have commentaries in one section and biographies in another and fiction in another. You just throw the books in there and they just light in the right shelf? No, of course not. A lot of thought and preparation goes into that kind of orderliness. And what this argument says is that when we look at our world, we see all kinds of examples of order, when the natural thing would be to see disorder and chaos. What does that order indicate? It indicates someone has made it possible. Then you have the regularities of temporal succession. And I know this may seem like a little more complicated than it needs to be, but I want us to really understand that this is a serious argument that really does sustain our faith in the existence of God. And in fact, it takes a whole lot more faith to argue that all of the design in the universe just happened. When experience tells us that when we just let things happen, that doesn't generally lead to organization, but rather to chaos. But what we see is a very organized world. Now, in relationship to the third principle, where order is seen in simple patterns of behavior in physical objects, the paths of heavenly bodies follow regular temporal sequences in accordance with the laws of gravity and motion. So that, again, when a moon launch takes place, they do not aim for where the moon is when the rocket lifts off from the Cape. They have to figure where the moon will be when the rocket or the satellite has traveled sufficiently to reach the moon. And how do you do that if it's a very chaotic thing? It's not. It's so ordered that it bespeaks design. And I marvel at those who have the ability to do the math and to hit the target. This past week, scientists were able to find a lost satellite which the nation of India had launched toward the moon several years ago. It was a satellite about, a meter or meter and a half cube. That's just a little more than a 3-foot cube. 247,000 miles away. I believe that's, don't quote me on this, I think that's about how far the moon is from the earth. The sun is 93 million. And they were actually able to finally locate that little cube orbiting the moon. That's pretty fantastic in my judgment. But think about how it got there. That wasn't accidental. There was a very orderly process. It's orbiting the moon around the poles at about 126 miles above the surface of the moon. Now think about that. You couldn't make those kinds of calculations and discoveries were our universe not so ordered. And order is not the norm. Chaos is the norm. How did it become so ordered? Because we have a creator. Then we have design of purpose. This is the one I think we usually think of when we think about the teleological argument, but there's so much more to it than that. It may refer to the orderly arrangement of parts in the object itself and the fact that they work together for some goal or end. It's like pointing to a watch and looking at how, have you taken a watch apart? It's not hard. Now, putting them back together, trust me, that's not easy. I have just always been fascinated by things, and I like to take things apart. And sometimes they're real easy to put back together, and sometimes they never go back together. My dad gave my brother and me an old Maytag washing machine motor, the gas-driven motor, and he said you can do with it whatever you want. We decided the first thing to do was take it all apart and clean it up. Well, as far as I know, it was sitting in a bushel basket in 100,000 pieces the last time I saw it. That was years ago. We never did get it back together, but it was sure a fascinating thing to take apart. The fact that it all will come together and work shows design, a purpose. It's a plan that works. When I think of design of purpose, I think of the unusual characteristics of water. Why is water the way it is? It's composed of two gases, hydrogen and oxygen. It never appears, I'm told, in a single molecule, but always two molecules. That's why when you see water, generally it's two H2O, two atoms of hydrogen, one atom of oxygen, come together, those gases, to form a liquid. A liquid with the unusual properties of turning into a gas at 212 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level, called steam, or turning into a solid at 32 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level, or 0 degrees Celsius. And this solid has the unique capacity of floating. It doesn't sink, it floats. Why? Well, what would happen if it didn't? It'd sink to the bottom, and then more would freeze until the fish would have nowhere to swim. You think that just happened accidentally, that water has these qualities? The purpose of the creation of God is seen in such a simple thing as water, and how God designed it to satisfy the needs of life. Design of simplicity comes to mind. Nature has really been simplified many, many times. Theories of science often exhibit a breathtaking simplicity. The movements as diverse as an apple falling from a tree and galaxies rotating can be explained by simple laws of motion expressed by Isaac Newton. I don't understand those laws, by the way, in case you're wondering. I'm glad there are people who do. The fact that our world exhibits this kind of unity and simplicity is taken as evidence for a designer, someone who made it possible. The picture you see is a picture of DNA, the double helix that is the essential building block of all of life. The more we learn about the universe, the more complex, incredibly complex it is, and the DNA is a good example of just how complex this world and life itself actually is. And yet it is so orderly and contains so much information contained in something so small that it's actually imperceptible by the human eye and requires extreme magnification. That little tidbit contains all the information to create a human being, contained in something so small that we can't even see it with the naked eye. How is that possible? Can you honestly believe that it just happened in the long ago when lightning struck the primordial soup, and the primordial soup, there's no evidence that such a thing ever existed, let alone that it was struck by lightning, out of which the first single-celled form of life originated, and from that all other life ultimately developed in the extent that we get to something as complex as DNA. And again, I've reminded you several times of the work of Francis Collins, who led the effort to uncover the human genome, the genetic code that comes from our DNA. He wrote a book, Language of God, in which the ultimate conclusion was it could not have come about accidentally. The complexity is of such an overwhelming nature that you just can't attribute it to chance. Now, there's a whole lot in his book that I wouldn't endorse and you would have real problems with. But the ultimate conclusion is valid. It could not have just happened, which was the book I mentioned last week that you might want to get for your children and your grandchildren. It is available at Amazon.com at a relatively inexpensive price right now, by the way. Several paperback volumes are available at 65 cents a piece, hardbacks for $6 or $7, and I know I paid a good bit more for the books I bought years ago. It's out of print, but it's just an excellent book. And I think that Dr. Collins's book is excellent from the perspective that when you look at his research, and he was the top in his field when he undertook this, that he had to conclude that this is not a product of chance. Now, he doesn't deny there's an evolutionary principle involved, which I would have real issue with. I think there's a great difference between micro, little, tiny changes and the macro evolution that says we went from a single-cell creature to where we are today. I find that just beyond belief, personally. But clearly, DNA is a product of design, the complexity of creation. Then the design of beauty. The pictures you see were taken by the Hubble telescope. And again, I don't understand the science and the engineering behind it, but I've seen a lot of the pictures that it has produced, and they're some of the most beautiful things that you'll see when that instrument of man is pointed to the heavens in the photographs, and there are many that are far more beautiful than the ones that I have here. Two aspects of beauty are under consideration: the beauty of the world itself and some of its aspects, and then the beauty of the theories which accurately describe the world and some of its aspects. How things are put together in a way that they work, and we're capable as human beings created in the image of our God in understanding, not just recognizing the beauty of the vision, but understanding the beauty of how this all came about and how it works. Then you have the arguments from sense and cognition. Several philosophers have pointed out the ability to perceive and think about the world accurately. To do this is evidence of the design, of the designer, an intelligent being who gave us this capability. You can contemplate your own existence. You can ask questions like, where did I come from? Why am I here? And what lies ahead, kind of things. That comes from our Creator who designed us that way. We can think accurately about our world in a way that no other creature can, because we are made in the image of our God. Then you have the design of information. And that, again, we would turn to DNA and talk about how the genetic code is a blueprint for constructing the entire human body, every cell, pre-programmed to form at just the right time and just the right way to produce the end result. And it's so well organized, and I've listed here, I'm not even going to read it to you. If you want to read it, you can. In the research to uncover DNA, this orderly process became very apparent, and how this information is transmitted is a very organized, precise method that bespeaks a designer. You think about some large building or some major invention of man, and all the effort and all the blueprints and instructions that go into putting something together, a 747 or a tall skyscraper, the planning, the preparation, the design, it takes reams of paper. And God was able to communicate the design for the human body in something so small that it is imperceptible to the human eye. The vast amount of information contained in a single cell really defies comprehension, but it's there. It didn't get there accidentally. A demonstration of design. Then we have the design of cosmic constants, the material of the observable universe, and this is beyond my comprehension. I just throw it out to you. Is such that the accuracy is within 0.1%. If it were not, then life as we know it would not be possible. The gravitational constant, the strong force, and then the weak force, and all of those things are just absolutely precise. If any of them varied even a little bit, life as we know it would be impossible. How did that happen? The argument is, well, the Creator made it that way. It's the design. The information of the universe, the balance of matter and antimatter, had to be accurate to within 1 part in 10 billion for the universe to arise. Again, I don't even understand that. But people who do are saying this had to be pre-planned. I'm going to talk to you at some point down the road about the anthropic principle. Anthropic comes from the Greek anthropos, for man, and the idea is very simple. When you look at this world and the universe in its totality, it becomes apparent that everything seems to have been made for one specific reason, for man. Everything is absolutely just right for human life. And you can't explain that accidentally. So what you have when you talk about arguments for the existence of God from the technical standpoint are, again, the following: Augustine's argument, the moral law, the ontological argument, the cosmological argument. We talked about three forms of that. One of the most interesting, I thought, was the Kalam argument that came from the Arab world, the teleological argument that we just discussed, and then finally the argument from divine revelation. I believe all we've said thus far points to the existence of God, but does not tell us what our Creator desires of us. It's going back to Psalm 19 for a moment and say, we can stare at the stars and know that there is a God, but we can stare at the stars forever and never know what He wants us to do with our lives. That's where this book comes into play. This is how the God of creation has given instruction to His creation through the written word, divine revelation. Now, we turn our attention at this point to the origin of man, where we came from. Genesis 1:26, let us make man in our own image. We have to choose which is the more reasonable, logical, and defensible choice: to acknowledge a God outside of this created material world, who is not a contingent being, that is, not dependent on anyone or anything else, who is eternal, an uncaused cause who brought everything into existence, or everything was just an accident. And that accident began with an explosion. That explosion came as a result of all of the matter in the universe compressed into one point, one dimensionless point. And we don't know where that matter pressed or compressed into that single dimensionless point originated, nor do we know why it exploded or what caused it to explode, but that's how we got here. And that explosion brought about all of this order and design and complexity and simplicity and everything that we've talked about. And when you start weighing the two options, there are no others. They're just either it was all an accident or God did it, which requires the greater faith. And the honest answer is it takes a whole lot more to reject God than to embrace Him. Why then do people reject Him? Because in His written revelation, He's told us how we as His creatures ought to behave, and people don't want to behave that way. If you can reject the very existence of God, then you can reject the standards for life which God has given, and therefore you're free to do whatever you want, and nobody has the right to sit in judgment. We just must simply tolerate each other, our differences, our different choices, and live and let live. And what do we see in our world today? That's where the focus is. Let's get rid of God. And when we get rid of God, we get rid of the Word of God, and then we're free to become gods ourselves and do whatever we want. So we can live life as we choose to live it without any accountability to our Creator. And this is what we're hearing over and over and over again. And it's been going on now for a couple of generations. And as a result, church attendance is declining, Bible reading is down. All of the things that we associate with faith in God are being cast aside so that people can become their own gods and make their own rules. And in that kind of world, nothing is ever right or wrong. Everything is situational or contextual, and you can never speak in absolutes. That's an absolute, by the way. What we learn as we look at the biblical narrative is that the Bible offers an explanation that is reasonable logical, and defensible. But people are not being exposed to it. And as a result, faith is on the decline. Genesis 2:18 through 23 just gives us a fuller account of the events of day 6. The critics of the Genesis account say that there are actually two accounts of creation. Chapter 2 differs from chapter 1. In fact, all chapter 2 does is expand on the events of day 6 in chapter 1. And furthermore, when you look at this narrative and you look at what you see in the observable universe, they're in complete harmony. What you see unfold in Genesis is what we honestly see when we look at our universe and how things came together. Now, in terms of the time involved, Genesis really doesn't tell. And so we make a grave mistake when we see in the text what isn't there. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. When was that? I don't have a clue. Then there is a succession of events from days 1 through 6 where the various aspects of that created heavens and earth take shape. When did that happen? Was there a delay between chapter 1, verse 1 and chapter 1, verse 2? We don't have any way in the world of knowing. And who cares? The point that is being made is that God created us. He created us in His image. We are really subject to the Creator, and to honor Him, we must honor His will, and He has not left us in the dark in that regard. He's given us the written word that informs us entirely pertaining to all that is necessary to a life well lived here and a life beyond this realm. Now, the old picture of the evolutionary development of man is illustrated. I don't know how clear that is, but it's illustrated from monkey to man and all of the so-called ancestors. Most of these folks that are depicted were hoaxes, many of them. There is no real evidence for the evolution of man. In fact, all of the so-called differences in the skeletal remains that have been uncovered can be duplicated in modern men today. Heads come in all different sizes and shapes, always have, no doubt always will. Some people are bigger, some people are smaller, some people's bones are larger, some are smaller. All of the differences that are supposedly illustrated in the development of man can still be found among modern men today. Were there cavemen? Well, of course there were. Native Americans lived in caves just a few hundred years ago here in America. That's a sign of intelligence. A cave is a pretty good house. It keeps a constant temperature, winter and summer, day and night. It provides some safety because you can block the entrance and keep the enemy out. It protects you from the elements of rain and snow. And think of cavemen, I think of really intelligent people who found a good place to live and made the most of it. And no doubt people lived in caves. They did so up until very recently in the history of human civilization. But to say that man evolved in this fashion is just absolutely ludicrous. When you look at the DNA, are there a lot of similarities? Yes. But that is what you would expect when the source of everything is God. You look at most automobiles today and you see all kinds of similarities. Why do they have 4 tires? Because that works best. There have been automobiles with 3. They don't work as well. They have 4. And why do they operate the way they are? Why? Because when you find something that works, you use it over and over and over again. Doesn't surprise me that you see that in God's creation. I would be more surprised if you didn't. These are actually evidences of God's existence. Next week, we'll get to this anthropic principle that I mentioned and talk a little bit about how our world was designed specifically for us. It could not have been accidental. And I'm going to be sharing with you some information from a book by a fellow by the name of Patrick Glenn. He was a professor in an Ivy League university who set out to demonstrate the validity of atheism, and came away from his study a believer in the sense that our world could not have come about by any other means than divine creation. It's a fascinating book. It's called God the Evidence. And